Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
The most important thing about the Master Sword is... it will kill.
You know, it's funny. In the more than 9 years that I've been making videos, I've dedicated videos to most of my favorite franchises. But I've never made a video strictly about The Legend of Zelda. One of Nintendo's biggest franchises, it's a favorite of many people, including myself. The adventures, the characters, the lore, it's all so fascinating. And while a few of the people I know well have talked extensively about this series, I haven't really dedicated anything big to it.
And this is coming from literally the only guy on YouTube who made a countdown dedicated to Arcana Heart of all things.
But with Zelda's 35th anniversary in full swing, I figured now is the right time to dive headfirst into the best that Hyrule has to offer. And for me, one of the highlights of the typical Zelda game is the dungeons. They tend to be where a lot of Zelda's key gameplay elements come together: exploring, puzzle solving, and combat. So when a dungeon really hits the mark, it can really make the game that much more memorable. A lot really goes into making a dungeon special, whether it's the atmosphere, the layout, how well it uses the items you get, for example. So I've gone through the archives in my brain to pick out 10 dungeons, one per game, that stuck out to me the most. While I'm talking shop here, I'd like to know what your favorite dungeons are once I'm done talking. Hey, engagement is fun. Okay, let's get down to some legending. It's game time! With most of the talk I hear about the Zelda series, a lot of it tends to focus on the 3D titles. Granted, that doesn't surprise me considering the impact of games like Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild. At the same time, however, I hear less about the more 2D games and almost no discussion about the DS titles. I don't even remember the last time someone talked about Spirit Tracks. That being said, I didn't find most of the dungeons in the game to be that memorable, with the exception, of course, of the hub of your whole adventure. At first, the Tower of Spirits may bring back bad memories of a certain dungeon from Phantom Hourglass.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Temple of the Ocean King. I'm not even gonna try to hide it.
But unlike that dungeon, there are some things about it that make it actually work. For one thing, with each time you revisit the tower to grab another rail map, you can skip the floors you've already completed. Second, no time limits. Third, and most importantly, is that this is where Zelda's ability to possess phantoms comes into play. The princess's little ghost trick lies at the crux of most of the puzzle solving here, and the results can be pretty damn creative. Not to mention, the boss fight with Burn was pretty solid, and took full advantage of Zelda's abilities. Honestly, this feels like the Temple of the Ocean King done right.
And considering how many degrees of fuck that was, all I can say is thank Hylia.
You wanna know one thing that typically sucks in video games? Escort missions. More often than not, they suffer from some common flaws. Dumbass AI, strict penalties if your charge gets injured, and possibly most irritating of all, how difficult it can be to keep your escortee safe. And Zelda's no stranger in this. At least A Link Between Worlds provides an escort mission that's actually decent in the form of the Thieves' Hideout. The dungeon as a whole takes some of the best advantage of the ability to merge into the walls. To be perfectly honest, I can't think of a better approach to stealth. Of course, you don't really have to worry about stealth that much. Instead, the game's key mechanic gives you the perfect way to sneak through bars and obtain treasure, across gaps to reach other areas of the dungeon, and most importantly, locate the thief girl in order to bust her out. And thus begins the escort mission itself. So, why does said escort mission not suck? In regards to the 3 pain points I mentioned earlier, items 1 and 3 are well accounted for. The girl's actions are basically red light, green light. There's a switch here. Red light! Door's open! Light's green! Let's move! Let's move! 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 Granted, if the girl gets hurt, it's back to the cell, so that's a bummer, but keeping her safe isn't completely aggravating thanks to the level design. In nearly every room with enemies, there's a safe spot for your tag-along, or a means to prevent the enemies from getting near her. Also, big ups for both the first theme of the dungeon and the change in music during the escort mission. and the fight with Stalblind at the end continues the creative use of the wall merging mechanic for about a third of the fight, at which point it returns to wait for the boss to expose himself, then wail away.
Well, at least we can give the monster credit for being smart.
It goes without saying that the final act of a game is one of the most important parts. After all, everything you've done throughout your entire adventure has been leading up to the climax. All the exploring, all the side quests you've done, all the bosses you've taken down, all for that one moment. Nailing the grand finale can really make a game that much more memorable. And A Link to the Past manages to pull that off. After saving the Seven Maidens, they use their power to break the seal on Ganon's tower where Aghanim is waiting. And if you think he'd make it easy for you, think again. This is a dungeon that's going to test you to the hilt. Everything will be tested in here, from your combat skills against a wide assortment of enemies from throughout your adventure, to your puzzle-solving skills as you try to figure out the best way to navigate the tower's traps, to your mastery of several of the game's items. You'll also face a rematch with each of the bosses from the Light World dungeons in here, each with their own little twist, but none of which should hinder you if you have the right strategy. In fact, with your sword powered up to the highest level here, Moldorm goes down in 2 hits. This is also the longest dungeon in the game, clocking in at 7 floors plus the basement, so it's a test of your endurance and will as well. Though to be fair, you're likely to spend a lot of time in the lower levels because that's where most of the treasures are, including the big key you'll need to reach the top, as well as the red mail which redoubles your defenses. All of it leads up to your big rematch with Aghanim, a frantic game of magical tennis against not only the wizard, but his 2 shadow clones. Come to think of it, A Link to the Past is where the whole ping-pong against Ganon started.
This, my friends, is how traditions are born.
It's hard to dispute the notion that Breath of the Wild is the most ambitious Zelda game to date. It forewent most of the traditions of past Zelda games, instead going for a vast open world with scale that few games can match. On the one hand, it allows for an amazing sense of freedom, letting you do things in whatever order you choose. On the other hand, its attempts at original dungeons may seem a bit jarring. Nintendo kinda tried to have its cake and eat it too with the dungeons. Whether it's the bite-sized shrines or the big divine beasts, nearly all of the dungeons didn't feel like a part of the world itself. Kinda makes it difficult to put a dungeon from this game on the list. Little did I realize that there was an answer staring me in the face the whole time. Hyrule Castle rarely disappoints, and this is no exception. Mainly because it's the only dungeon in the game that organically fits into the open world theme. In fact, this feels like it lays the blueprints for a whole new type of dungeon because of how open-ended it is. From the moment you sail down from the Great Plateau, the questions of when and how are up to you to answer, and the only grade is whether or not your approach works. Infiltrate the castle from the basement? Sure. Use the moats to find an entrance after freeing the beasts and maxing out your gear? Go for it. Go Leroy Jenkins with 3 hearts in your skivvies? Hope you have chicken. The only constant is your destination. Not to mention there's lots of ground to explore, some interesting lore, and the game's toughest monsters out for your gore. All of this is underscored with an incredibly grand and ominous theme playing. Honestly, it gives me chills hearing a theme that incorporates Ganon's leitmotif and the theme of the whole series. Honestly, I'm hoping to see more open-ended dungeons like this in the future. That is, if open world is going to be the standard for the franchise from now on.
Now, if only the final battle with Calamity Ganon didn't drop the rupees!
Why don't I hear more people talking about the Minish Cap? As the prequel to the Four Swords Saga, it's honestly the best thing to come out of the 3-game Zelda collab between Nintendo and Capcom. It takes full advantage of its gameplay hooks, mainly Honey, I Shrunk the Hero, and Link's Shadow Clone Jutsu that gets stronger as you gather the 4 elements throughout the dungeons. Oh, that's right, the dungeons are pretty good in this game too. Each of them handles the game's mechanics well. Heck, 2 of them are actually miniature dungeons where you go through them as Mini-Link. But I feel the Palace of Winds handles things best. As the home of the last of the 4 elements you need to max out your clone power, this dungeon is actually built up in the second half of the game, seeing that it's hinted at when you complete the 3rd dungeon, the Fortress of Winds, where you get a bog-standard ocarina when you thought you'd be getting the wind element. The dungeon itself has the right mix of action and puzzles, and the level design will test your abilities to a great extent. Not to mention, this is the dungeon which contains the Rock's Cape, which I feel is the single best item in the whole game. You would not believe how liberating it is to be able to jump and glide in a game where you're normally confined to the ground. And the dungeon takes advantage of this in how it integrates platforming into the level design where it normally would be impossible. Oh, and I almost forgot about the fast one this temple pulls on you. Don't you find it weird that you find the big key before the map or the compass? Yeah, that big door doesn't lead to the boss. There's still a mini-boss and another 3 floors before you wrap up. By the way, the Gjork pair is a great boss fight that actually takes advantage of your cloning. It's frantic and exciting and a much better Gjork battle than Majora's Mask.
If I do a worst dungeons list, expect no mercy on that. People are probably already asking for that list, it's inevitable.
Wind Waker is one of my favorite games in the series, and I'm glad that it eventually got the recognition it deserved, given the initial reaction of a lot of outlets. As for the dungeons, I felt that most of them were simply okay. As for the one that stood out, that would be the midpoint dungeon, the Tower of the Gods, which was the reason that you were going around collecting those pearls in the first place.
I can only imagine the oysters that pearls like those would have come from. Well, if I didn't know that they were divine treasures, of course.
After the rising of the tower, which is admittedly both epic and hilarious at the same time, seriously, Toon Link has the worst luck with getting launched into the distance, you learn that this tower was built to test the courage of men. And let me tell you, it lives up to that reputation. First part is just outside the main tower where you have to synchronize your progress to the ebb and flow of the tide. It's nothing too complicated, unlike the water temple, so you shouldn't have too much trouble. Then you enter the main part of the tower, and this is where the atmosphere really struck me. It's so majestic, and the themes sound so ghostly. Next part is a series of clever statue puzzles. This is where you'll learn the command melody, which will come in handy later in the game, and you'll use it here to take control of statues and navigate them back to the center for quite the family reunion. This is also where you get the all-useful and all-iconic Hero's Bow, which is just the thing you need for dealing with all these keys, and it's guarded by the imposing and equally iconic Dark Nut, which you'll be facing many times from here on out. By contrast, the chamber of the boss, Godan, has a strange high-tech feel to it. Pretty impressive for another head and hands boss. But the real reward is when you finally get to see 50s TV Hyrule and get your hands on the Master Sword.
And to think all this happened because a giant bird stole Link's sister. Things we do for family, I swear.
Ocarina of Time was a landmark for this series, and that's a term I don't use lightly. Bringing the series into 3D and making it work, introducing us to more of the races of Hyrule, and fully establishing Ganon as something more than a big scary pig monster.
You couldn't pay me to eat those pork chops.
But I think one of the coolest things about Ocarina of Time is what it did for dungeons, not just in the level design, but in the atmosphere as well. As a result, most of the dungeons in the game are really memorable. Some for better reasons than others. This was honestly a difficult decision here, but I felt that the most complete package from this game was the penultimate dungeon, the Spirit Temple. First thing I love about this dungeon is the atmosphere. It really feels like something out of ancient Egypt with its aesthetic. The ancient script on the walls even looks like hieroglyphics, not to mention the music. It's just so eerie and yet majestic all at the same time. But the other thing I really like about this dungeon is that it kind of feels like 2 dungeons in one, since you visit this place as both young Link and adult Link. The first time you go through this place, you meet Naburu, the Gerudo thief who's actually the only sage you don't meet prior to your dungeon run, and she figures you might be able to help her find the silver gauntlets for her. Yeah, no trouble, some standard combat, some puzzles that introduce how light can be used later, and oh crap, it's an iron knuckle! They're actually not that bad. And once you get the gloves, you get your first look at the dungeon's bosses dragging your sage into a sand pit. 7 years later. Now that you can actually use those gauntlets yourself, you've got Part 2, where your introduction to light puzzles pays off when you get the beautiful mirror shield. The twist with that last iron knuckle really made me want to cut a witch or two. Good thing the fight with the twin Rova sisters is one of the best boss fights in the game. I really do appreciate how the Spirit Temple takes advantage of both time periods, and combined with the atmosphere, it's a highlight of an already iconic game.
Time travel! What? I see this as an absolute win.
Water dungeons! Why? Just why? I know water levels tend to be problematic, but they seem to be especially bad in the Zelda series. Why did they make the water temple about constantly changing the water level and getting lost half the time? Why did they make the Great Bay Temple such a confusing mess dictated by the flow of currents? Why does the Temple of Droplets have to combine water with ice physics? Can I get just one good water dungeon?
Praise be to Hylia, for she hath granted us the gift of Sword Scored!
The second half of Skyward Sword granted Link the power to actually swim properly. Granted, Twilight Princess gave you items to swim, but the related dungeon didn't do nearly as much to take advantage of that as the Ancient Cistern. First off, oh my goodness, this place is beautiful. The grand golden chamber which greets you as you enter, the serene music that plays throughout the place, and that gigantic and imposing Buddha statue that dominates the chamber. In fact, this whole place is just smothered in Buddhist symbolism. I mean, the grandiose atmosphere of the upper floors kind of feels like heaven, doesn't it? And then you have to go into the basement, and there's poisoned water and cursed bokoblins, and the music suddenly takes an eerie turn. It's like you've ended up in hell, and you gotta climb up there by a rope that eerily resembles a spider thread while being chased by more of those cursed bokoblins. This is actually based on a Buddhist story.
Symbolism for the win! You can't go wrong!
Well, the whip isn't exactly an item that gets me making noise, but they do manage to put it to good use here, from flipping lily pads to snagging keys from behind gates. The water doesn't even really dominate the level, and even when you do venture underwater, it feels good to do so. Not only because the transition is so smooth, but because the swimming controls don't feel like a slog. And to top it all off, it wraps up with one of the best fights in the game and the franchise, Koloktos, a six-armed mechanical monstrosity which is modeled after Ashura, giving us more Buddhist symbolism. Not to mention it feels satisfying as hell to tear off its arms and tear it apart with its own gigantic swords.
Now that is how you do a water dungeon. So, how is Breath of the Wild gonna handle its water dungeon? Yeah, no, that ain't it, Chief.
One thing I've learned about the Zelda franchise, not only from playing the games themselves, but also watching dungeon analysis and theory videos, is that there's some pretty freaking dark shit going on. Ocarina of Time's Shadow Temple could only be described as a goddamn torture chamber. The same game's Bottom of the Well is home to one of the most disturbing bosses in the series. The ghost ship in Phantom Hourglass is, well, a ghost ship, and a kind of canyon in Majora's Mask.
Yeah, that pretty much speaks for itself.
It does seem like most Zelda games have at least one area with dark and disturbing undertones. So, where does Twilight Princess fit into this? Well, the game as a whole is what I can best describe as moody. The game's tone and atmosphere lend itself to a game that's decidedly gloomy and can sometimes be downright unsettling. Quite a shift compared to Wind Waker.
But can anyone be surprised after the initial reaction to Wind Waker's art style? Fans can be really fickle, I swear.
One place in particular really cranks up this feeling, and that, my friends, is the Arbiter's Grounds. Built in the northern area of Gerudo Desert as a prison for Hyrule's most dangerous criminals, though this place looks more like a coliseum from the outside, you can already tell this is going to be some creepy-ass stuff going on in here. It's like the Spirit Temple and the Shadow Temple did the Hyrule Shuffle. I swear I can hear Bongo Bongo playing the drums that back the theme. And as one would expect for a prison of the dead, this place is chock full of undead enemies. Stall children, Stalfos, Gibdos, pose that look more disturbing than ever. You have to rip out their souls, mind you. And let's not forget you being slowed down by ghoul rats, oh Hylia, they're everywhere! While there are dark areas in this dungeon, which I normally hate, they're actually handled well because there's a place to refill your
lamp oil.
Later on, you'll fight a ghostly swordsman for the spinner, and then the rest of the dungeon becomes a playground for one of the most fun items in the series, if not also one of the most underutilized. It honestly would have been nice if this thing got more use throughout the rest of the game than it got. Oh well, at least they made use of it in Hyrule Warriors. As for the boss, the fight with Stalord is just awesome, starting out as the most badass game of Beyblades ever, and ending with a thrilling chase up the walls of the chamber. An awesome capstone to a great dungeon that's both creepy and fun. Oh, and there's also that bit about Ganondorf and some divine prank, but yeah, Demon Lords aren't exactly that easy anyway, am I right? Okay, before we get to number 1, here are a few honorable mentions. The Great Palace from Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, the Lanayru Mining Facility from Skyward Sword, the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, the Snow Peak Ruins from Twilight Princess, and Lorule Castle from A Link Between Worlds. And now let's see what our followers have to say with this month's Patron Picks.
Thieves Town from A Link to the Past.
It's a really good dungeon to explore with a fun boss to fight.
Despite this dungeon being infamous for plenty of reasons, I like how it's used as a plot point throughout the game. Most dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series you just complete once and never come back.
The Fire Temple from Ocarina of Time. Let me tell you something. This temple is amazing. The key item here is a big stinking hammer, which you can then use to engage a dragon in a game of whack-a-mole on steroids at the end. Who could ask for anything better at that point, in my opinion?
Now there's one fondly remembered game that has yet to be mentioned on this list. And yeah, I was gonna get to it eventually, but I'm gonna be real here for a moment. I don't think most of the dungeons in Majora's Mask are really that special. Both the Woodfall Temple and the Snowhead Temple I found to be largely unmemorable. Most of the mini-dungeons didn't get me excited, and I'd rather eat an Octorok than subject myself to the Great Bay Temple ever again. But then again, maybe they were saving all their good ideas for the fourth and final temple region. Remember what I said about Ikana Canyon earlier? Yeah, featuring such things as a father who's being turned into a mummy, the haunted ruins of a fallen kingdom, and a temple that's been brought up repeatedly on lists like this. Now I could just be a contrarian old fuck, or I could take the high road and say, well, there's a good reason that the Stone Tower Temple has been mentioned so often. It's just that damn good. A literal giant among dungeons in the series, this place has it all. Variety, challenge, atmosphere, awesome rewards, and even some thought-provoking design. Simply getting to the entrance to the temple is a clever challenge, involving climbing the tower's exterior while setting up creepypasta fuel to solve some block puzzles to make your way up. And once you get inside, it is simply and beautifully haunting. The architecture feels grandiose and imposing at the same time. Some say it was built to mock the goddesses, with a hand pointing up in particular seeming to say, "Tonight, you." And the haunting yet strangely upbeat theme that plays throughout. And the level design will test your mastery of all Link's forms. Normal Link and his arsenal, and especially the Mirror Shield. Deku Link and his flower power gliding from one spot to the next. Goron Link and his monster strength and his ability to go hot tumbling in lava. And Zora Link and his underwater prowess. But things really get interesting once you defeat the Garo Master and obtain the light arrows, allowing you to literally turn everything on its head. Suddenly, this place almost feels like two dungeons in one, and when you think about it, this could be seen as the goddess's way of saying no you and turning the people's hubris into a one-way ticket towards hell. Kinda reminds you of the Tower of Babel, doesn't it? Of course, this could all be a bunch of theory bait, but hey, it's fun to speculate. Now that you have an upside-down tower to traverse, things get even creepier, with the music changing tone and another mini-boss who's basically the Grim Reaper, not to mention you'll be flipping the tower back and forth quite a few times here. It's a mixture of excellent design, clever puzzles, a boss fight where Ultraman fans can live vicariously through the Giant's Mask, and symbolism that sparks the imagination. This place is the total package, offering so much for a dungeon. In fact, it almost makes going through the Great Bay Temple worth it. Almost.
Meanwhile, we have the sequel to Breath of the Wild still in development, no doubt having run into setbacks through the... And I can only hope that it'll have the kind of dungeons that can really get me excited. At least Mr. Aonuma was transparent about there being news about it later this year. My money's on the season of E3, which I'm figuring is going virtual this year. Hey, it'd be better than last year when it was just cancelled, right? I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, QG at the arcade, coming April